Summer, 1944. The crackling of gunfire, the screaming wind, and the growing darkness. That's how it all started. Lieutenant Ivanenko stood on the edge of a steep cliff, trembling but determined. His eyes fixed on a contraption that looked more like a terrible joke than any serious piece of equipment, a makeshift parachute sewn from torn newspapers, stacked and glued with quick-drying glue and scraps of fabric. The fabric was fragile, the paper was crisp but weak, and everyone mocked him when he showed it off. "That thing's just newspaper," one soldier chuckled. "You're going to fall faster than a rock." But Ivanenko knew the truth. Sometimes, in war, innovation is born from desperation. The enemy had encircled them, supplies were dwindling, and the only way out was through guts, ingenuity, and, believe it or not, a parachute made of paper. With a deep breath, he adjusted his gear, glanced once more at his comrades, and whispered, "If I don't make it, find your own way out. But I'll try this. One last leap of faith." And then, without hesitation, he jumped. The newspaper wings fluttered awkwardly, torn, unstable, almost useless. The wind caught them, spiraling him downward in a chaotic dance. From a distance, it looked like a paper doll tossed into a storm. Close up, it was a desperate act, proving that sometimes even the most fragile thing can change everything. In that moment, as he descended into enemy territory, Ivanenko's mind flashed with memories of his family, of his comrades, of all the reasons he fought. Every second felt like a lifetime and a fleeting eternity all at once. The paper contorted, wobbled, and finally caught a steady gust. Against all odds, the impossible worked. He was falling, but he was alive. That leap in 1944, seemingly foolish, almost ridiculous, became a legendary testament to human ingenuity under pressure. Like a fragile paper bird, Ivanenko's leap defied what seemed possible, a story that would echo through history and challenge the very limits of survival. The dense forest surrounding Lieutenant Ivanenko and his comrades was heavy with the scent of pine and smoke. The war had carved scars into the landscape, burnt-out barns, shattered windows, and the silent witness of empty streets strewn with debris. It was in this devastated place that a fragile hope was born. Ivanenko had long realized that conventional tools and supplies would not save them this time. Communication lines were severed, reinforcements delayed indefinitely, and the enemy pressed in from all sides. It was amid this chaos that Ivanenko's mind turned to improvisation, a skill often more valuable than a rifle on the battlefield. Digging through the remnants of an abandoned house one evening, he found a stack of yellowed newspapers, brittle and overlooked. Inspiration struck. What if these fragile pages could be transformed into something new, something that could carry a man to safety? For nights, beneath the harsh flicker of a makeshift oil lamp, Ivanenko worked, carefully folding the paper into thick, overlapping layers, reinforcing them with scraps of cloth torn from old uniforms. He fashioned a rudimentary harness from leather belts scavenged from an empty supply crate. The result was crude, delicate, and yet filled with a fierce promise. His comrades watched with a mix of skepticism and bewildered curiosity. "You'd have better luck flying on a prayer," one said, half laughing, half worried. Yet, in Ivanenko's eyes burned a quiet certainty. Every fold, every stitch was a gamble against death itself. He tested the canopy by tossing it from low branches, refining after each trial. The delicate paper sighed under the wind's pressure, but held just barely. This was more than a parachute. It was a symbol of defiance, a tool born not from factories or arsenals, but from grit and determination. The ramifications of that small, improvised device would reach far beyond the immediate moment. It represented the unyielding ingenuity of men forced to innovate or perish, a beacon of hope amid the grinding darkness of war. The situation had deteriorated rapidly over the past 72 hours. What began as a routine reconnaissance mission had turned into a nightmare of survival. Enemy forces, moving with unexpected speed and precision, had cut off all escape routes. Ivanenko's unit found themselves trapped in a pocket of dense woodland, surrounded on three sides by hostile troops and backed against a steep ravine. The men were exhausted. Days of constant movement, minimal sleep, and dwindling rations had taken their toll. Their radio equipment had been damaged in a skirmish 2 days earlier, leaving them completely isolated from command. No reinforcements were coming. No rescue was possible. Lieutenant Ivanenko gathered his men in a small clearing as dusk settled over the forest. Their faces were grim, streaked with dirt and fatigue. Some nursed wounds wrapped in torn cloth. Others stared blankly at the ground, the weight of their predicament evident in their posture. "We have 2 options," Ivanenko said quietly, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We can try to fight our way through the enemy lines, a move that will likely cost us everything. Or we find another way." The soldiers exchanged glances. They all knew the odds of a frontal assault. It would be suicide. "What other way is there?" asked Corporal Petrov, a young man barely 20 years old, his eyes reflecting both fear and desperate hope. Ivanenko looked toward the ravine, where the cliff dropped sharply into enemy-controlled territory below. It was a calculated risk, an idea so outlandish that it bordered on madness. But in war, sometimes madness was the only rational choice left. "We go down," he said simply, "but not the way they expect." The announcement was met with stunned silence, followed by a ripple of disbelief. Down the cliff? With what? Sergeant Volkov, a veteran of numerous campaigns, shook his head. "We don't have rappelling equipment. We don't have ropes strong enough to support a man's weight down that distance." Ivanenko nodded. "You're right. We don't have conventional equipment, but we have something else. Resourcefulness." He pulled out the makeshift newspaper parachute he had been working on in secret. The contraption looked absurd in the fading light, a patchwork of yellowed paper, fabric scraps, and improvised stitching. It seemed more like a child's art project than a life-saving device. The reaction was immediate. Several soldiers laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of sheer incredulity. Others simply stared, unable to process what they were seeing. "Lieutenant, with all respect," Volkov said carefully, "that thing won't hold a sparrow, let alone a grown man." "It's suicide," another soldier muttered. Ivanenko understood their skepticism. He had wrestled with the same doubts during the long nights of construction. The physics seemed impossible. The materials were laughably inadequate, and yet he had studied the principles of aerodynamics, observed how even the lightest materials could catch and redirect air. He had tested smaller versions, watched them float and drift. "I won't order anyone to use it," Ivanenko said firmly. "But I will go first. If it works, others can follow. If it doesn't," he paused, the implication clear. "If it doesn't, then you'll know to find another way." The men fell silent. The weight of their commander's willingness to risk his own life hung heavy in the air. It was a stark reminder of the desperate reality they faced. While his men rested and kept watch, Ivanenko returned to his makeshift parachute, making final adjustments by the dim light of a shielded lantern. Every detail mattered now. Every fold, every reinforcement could mean the difference between life and death. The basic principle was sound, he reminded himself. Parachutes had been used successfully for decades. The first successful parachute jump dated back to the late 18th century. By the early 20th century, aviators routinely carried them as safety equipment. The technology was proven, but those parachutes were made of silk, carefully engineered and tested. His was made of newspaper. Still, the fundamental physics remained the same. Create enough surface area to generate air resistance, slow the descent to a survivable speed. The newspapers, layered and reinforced, could provide that surface area. The fabric strips and glue added structural integrity. The harness, crude as it was, would distribute the load across his body. He had calculated the weight-to-surface area ratio as best he could without proper instruments. The cliff was approximately 40 meters high, enough to build terminal velocity in a free fall, but also enough distance for the parachute to deploy and slow his descent if it worked correctly. The biggest unknown was durability. Would the paper tear under the stress? Would the glue hold? Would the harness support his weight? There were no guarantees, only hope, calculation, and desperate necessity. As he worked, Corporal Petrov approached quietly. The young soldier watched for a moment before speaking. "Do you really think it will work, sir?" Ivanenko looked up, meeting the younger man's eyes. He could have lied, offered false confidence, but these men deserved honesty. "I think it's our best chance," he said simply. And sometimes, that's enough. The hours before dawn were the longest. The men took turns on watch, while others tried to rest, knowing that the next day would determine their fate. The forest around them was eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional distant sound of enemy patrol movements. Ivanenko couldn't sleep. His mind raced through scenarios, calculations, contingencies. He thought of his family back home, his wife Anna, his daughter Katya, barely 5 years old when he last saw her. Would he see them again? Or would tomorrow bring his end on the rocks below? He thought of the men under his command. Young men, most of them, sons, brothers, husbands, each with their own families waiting, their own dreams deferred by war. He bore the weight of their lives, their trust. Sergeant Volkov sat down beside him, offering a cigarette. Ivanenko accepted, and they smoked in silence for a while. "I've seen a lot of crazy things in this war," Volkov said finally, "but this might be the craziest." Ivanenko smiled faintly. "Crazy times call for crazy solutions." "If you make it down," Volkov continued, "what then? You'll be in enemy territory, alone. I'll signal if it's safe. If I can draw their attention, create a diversion, maybe some of you can slip through while they're focused on me." Volkov shook his head. "You're planning to sacrifice yourself." "I'm planning to give us all a chance," Ivanenko corrected. "There's a difference." They sat in silence again, watching the stars through the canopy of trees above. Somewhere in that vast darkness, beyond the war and chaos, life continued. Children played, lovers embraced, ordinary people lived ordinary lives. It seemed like another world entirely. "Sir," Volkov said quietly, "it's been an honor serving with you." Ivanenko clasped his shoulder. "We're not done yet, Sergeant. Save the farewells for when we're actually beaten." But both men knew the truth. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or doom, and the line between the two was as thin as newspaper. Dawn broke gray and cold. Mist clung to the forest floor as Ivanenko and his men made their way to the cliff's edge. The ravine yawned before them, a vertical drop into shadow and uncertainty. Ivanenko strapped on the newspaper parachute, checking each connection point one final time. The harness sat snugly across his chest and shoulders. The folded canopy rested against his back, surprisingly light, yet somehow feeling heavier than any equipment he had ever carried. His men gathered around, their faces a mixture of admiration, fear, and disbelief. This was it, the moment of truth. "If this works," Ivanenko said, addressing them one last time, "wait for my signal. 3 short whistles means it's safe to attempt your own descent, by rope, by improvised methods, whatever you can manage. If you don't hear from me..." He let the sentence hang. "Good luck, sir," Petrov said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ivanenko nodded, then turned to face the abyss. His heart pounded. His palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. Every instinct screamed at him to step back, to find another way. But there was no other way. He thought of Anna, of Katya, of home, and then he jumped. The first second was pure terror. Gravity seized him, pulling him down with inexorable force. The wind roared in his ears. The ground rushed up toward him. Then the parachute deployed. The canopy caught the air with a sharp snap, and suddenly his plummet became a controlled descent. The newspaper held, miraculously, impossibly, it held. The layers of paper billowed out above him, creating the drag he needed. He was falling, yes, but falling slowly, falling survivably. The ground approached, and Ivanenko bent his knees, preparing for impact. He hit hard, rolling to absorb the shock. Pain shot through his ankle, but he was alive. Bruised, shaken, but alive. Above him, he could see his men peering over the cliff edge, their faces shocked and jubilant. He had done it. The impossible had become possible. Quickly, he checked his surroundings. He was in enemy territory, but this section seemed momentarily clear. He had minutes at most before patrols arrived. He cupped his hands around his mouth and whistled, 3 short, sharp bursts. The signal. His mission wasn't over. But against all odds, he had proven that sometimes ingenuity and courage could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. The newspaper parachute lay crumpled beside him, torn and battered but still intact enough to have saved his life. A fragile thing, a ridiculous thing, a miraculous thing. Ivanenko moved quickly, gathering the remnants of his parachute and concealing himself in the underbrush near the base of the cliff. Every sound seemed amplified: the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, his own ragged breathing. He was deep in enemy territory now, with no backup and limited resources. Above him, he could hear movement. His men were attempting their own descents, using ropes fashioned from belts and fabric, lowering themselves with agonizing slowness. Some might make it, others might not. But he had given them a chance. He needed to create a diversion, to draw enemy attention away from the cliff face and give his men precious time. He checked his weapon, still functional despite the jump. He had 2 grenades left, a knife, and determination. Moving through the forest with the stealth learned from years of combat experience, Ivanenko worked his way toward where he knew enemy supply lines ran. If he could disrupt them, cause confusion, it might buy his men the time they needed. The forest was beautiful in the early morning light, he noticed absently. Strange how war could coexist with such natural peace. Birds sang, sunlight filtered through the trees, and men prepared to kill each other. He found what he was looking for: a supply depot, lightly guarded. 3 soldiers stood watch, their attention focused outward, not expecting anyone to approach from the direction of the cliff. Why would they? It was considered impassable. Ivanenko smiled grimly. They hadn't counted on a newspaper parachute. He waited, timing his move. Patience was crucial. 1 guard walked away to relieve himself, reducing the immediate threat. The other 2 were engaged in conversation, momentarily distracted. Now. Ivanenko moved like a shadow, closing the distance with deadly efficiency. The first guard went down silently, never knowing what hit him. The second turned just in time to see Ivanenko before meeting the same fate. The third, returning from the trees, reached for his weapon but was too slow. Within 30 seconds, it was done. Ivanenko secured the depot entrance and quickly surveyed its contents. Ammunition, food supplies, medical equipment, all valuable, all about to become unavailable to the enemy. He placed his grenades strategically, set a delayed fuse using a burning scrap of cloth, and withdrew. He had perhaps 3 minutes. As he disappeared back into the forest, the explosion rocked the morning air. Shouts erupted from the enemy camp. Soldiers rushed toward the commotion, exactly as Ivanenko had planned, away from the cliff, away from his men. He allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Then he kept moving. Survival meant staying ahead of the search parties that would soon be scouring the area. The enemy response was swift and organized. Within minutes of the explosion, search parties fanned out through the forest. Dogs barked in the distance. Ivanenko could hear orders being shouted in harsh, clipped tones. He moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few minutes. His ankle throbbed from the landing, but adrenaline kept him mobile. He used every trick he knew, wading through streams to break his scent trail, doubling back to confuse pursuers, using natural terrain to mask his passage. But he was one man against dozens, possibly hundreds. The net was tightening. As he crouched behind a fallen log, catching his breath, he heard voices approaching. 2 enemy soldiers moving cautiously through the underbrush, weapons ready. Ivanenko stayed perfectly still, controlling his breathing. They were close, perhaps 10 meters away. If they continued on their current path, they would pass without seeing him. One of the soldiers stopped, scanning the area. For a terrible moment, his eyes seemed to look directly at Ivanenko's hiding place. Time froze. Ivanenko's hand moved to his knife. Then the soldier's companion called out, and they moved on, their attention shifting elsewhere. Ivanenko exhaled slowly. That was too close. He needed to put more distance between himself and the search parties. But where could he go? The enemy controlled all the territory for kilometers in every direction. His only hope was to evade long enough for his men to escape, then try to work his way back to friendly lines. It was a slim hope, but it was hope nonetheless. As night fell, exhausted and with his supplies nearly gone, Ivanenko stumbled upon something unexpected. A small cottage, isolated and dark, deep in the forest. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting inhabitants. He approached cautiously. Civilians in occupied territory were unpredictable. Some collaborated with the enemy, others resisted quietly. Most just tried to survive. Before he could decide whether to approach, the door opened. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, a lantern in her hand. She looked at him for a long moment, taking in his uniform, his exhaustion, his obvious status as a fugitive. "You're running from them," she said. It wasn't a question. Ivanenko nodded warily, ready to flee if necessary. The woman glanced around, then gestured quickly. "Inside. Quickly." He hesitated only a moment before accepting. He was out of options. The cottage was small but warm. An elderly man sat by the fire, his eyes milky with cataracts. He didn't look up as Ivanenko entered. "My husband," the woman explained. "He can't see well anymore, but he can hear everything." She brought Ivanenko bread and water, simple fare but precious under occupation. "They've been searching all day," she said. "Turned over half the village looking for someone. Was that you?" "I don't want to bring trouble to your home," Ivanenko said. The woman smiled sadly. "Trouble is already here, young man. It's been here since they arrived. At least let me feed you before you go." As he ate, the old man spoke for the first time. "They killed our son last winter. Said he was helping partisans." His voice was rough with old grief. "Was he?" The woman's eyes glistened. "Does it matter? He was our son." Ivanenko felt the weight of their loss, so much suffering, so many broken families. The war consumed everything. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Don't be sorry," the woman said. "Just survive. And when this is over, remember us. Remember that there were people here who tried to help when they could." She gave him what supplies she could spare: food, a blanket, directions to a safer route through the forest. Then, as dawn approached, she sent him on his way. "Thank you," Ivanenko said. "Thank yourself," she replied. "You're the one brave enough, or crazy enough, to jump off a cliff with a newspaper. They'll be telling that story for years." He blinked in surprise. "How did you know about that?" She smiled mysteriously. "The forest has eyes and ears, soldier. Your men made it through, most of them anyway. They're heading west. Maybe you can catch up to them." Hope surged in Ivanenko's chest. His men had survived. The sacrifice had been worth it. Following the old woman's directions, Ivanenko made his way west, moving by night and hiding by day. The journey took 3 days, 3 days of constant vigilance, near misses, and sheer determination. He encountered enemy patrols twice more, evading them both times through a combination of luck and skill. He crossed contested territory where the front lines blurred, where neither side fully controlled the ground. It was dangerous, chaotic, but also offered opportunities for a lone soldier to slip through. On the 3rd night, he heard voices speaking in his own language. Relief flooded through him as he identified himself to a forward scout from a friendly unit. "Lieutenant Ivanenko," the scout said incredulously. "Sir, your men reported you missing in action. They said you sacrificed yourself so they could escape." "Not quite," Ivanenko said with a tired smile. "Where are they now?" "About 5 kilometers west, at the regimental headquarters. They're being debriefed." Ivanenko's reunion with his men was emotional. Sergeant Volkov embraced him openly, tears streaming down his grizzled face. Corporal Petrov couldn't stop grinning. Even the hardened veterans seemed moved. "We thought you were dead, sir," Volkov said. "Takes more than a newspaper to kill me, Sergeant," Ivanenko replied, drawing tired laughter. But there was sadness too. 3 men hadn't made it, lost during the descent or captured afterward. Ivanenko felt their absence like a weight on his soul. 3 families who would receive devastating news. 3 lives ended too soon. Still, 9 had survived. 9 men who would have certainly died if not for that desperate gamble on a cliff edge. The regimental commander listened to Ivanenko's report with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "A parachute made of newspapers," he repeated. "I wouldn't believe it if your men hadn't corroborated the story." "Desperate times, sir," Ivanenko said simply. "Indeed." The commander studied him for a moment. "You showed exceptional resourcefulness and courage, Lieutenant. I'll be recommending you for commendation." Ivanenko nodded, but the praise felt hollow. He hadn't done it for medals. He had done it to save his men. The war eventually ended, though it would take another year of brutal fighting before peace finally came. Ivanenko survived to see it, carrying his experiences and the memory of that newspaper parachute with him always. Years later, sitting in his modest home with his family around him, he would sometimes tell the story to his grandchildren. They would listen with wide eyes, hardly believing that their gentle grandfather had once jumped off a cliff with nothing but newspapers to save him. "Did it really work, grandfather?" they would ask. "It really did," he would reply, smiling, "though I don't recommend trying it yourself." The story spread, as war stories do. It became legend, embellished with each retelling. Some versions were accurate, others were not. But at the core, the truth remained. Sometimes survival depends not on the weapons you carry or the strength of your army, but on human ingenuity and the willingness to take impossible risks. Historians later noted the incident in studies of improvisation during wartime. Engineers analyzed the principles that made it work. Military academies cited it as an example of creative problem-solving under pressure. But for Ivanenko, it remained something simpler and more profound. It was the moment when he learned that the line between life and death could be as thin as paper, and that sometimes that was enough. He kept a piece of that original parachute, yellowed and fragile, in a small box in his study. Occasionally he would take it out, running his fingers over the brittle newsprint, remembering that dawn, that jump, that impossible flight. His wife Anna understood why he kept it. "It saved your life," she said once. "More than that," he replied, "it saved my faith in human resilience. When everything seems impossible, when all conventional solutions fail, we find new ways forward. We adapt. We survive." She kissed his forehead gently. "You gave those men hope when they had none." "They gave me something too," he said. "They believed in me enough to follow, even when the plan seemed insane. That kind of trust, that's what binds soldiers together. That's what makes us more than just individuals fighting alone." As the years passed and memories of the war faded, Ivanenko's newspaper parachute became a family heirloom, passed down through generations. Each new custodian heard the story, understood its significance. It stands now as a reminder, not of war's glory, for there is precious little of that, but of war's fundamental truth, that humans, when pushed to the brink, when faced with impossible choices, possess a remarkable capacity for innovation and courage. The newspaper parachute that should never have worked, that defied all reasonable expectations, that saved 9 lives and inspired countless others. It proved that sometimes the most fragile things can carry the heaviest burdens. And perhaps that is the real legacy, not the parachute itself, but what it represents: hope, ingenuity, the refusal to surrender even when defeat seems certain. In the end, that is what allows us to survive not just war, but any of life's impossible challenges. The willingness to fold our fears into something useful, the courage to jump when staying means certain doom, the faith that even paper-thin chances are still chances worth taking. Ivanenko lived to the age of 87, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. When he finally passed peacefully in his sleep, they found him with that scrap of newspaper clutched gently in his hand, his paper wings, his impossible salvation, his reminder that miracles sometimes are just courage and newsprint combined.